Well, greetings and welcome to episode 174 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation. We're on the letter of James, part 2, and what we're going to look at today is one of the most controversial or argued about, I think, misinterpreted verses in the New Testament, where Paul writes, "So, faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead." That verse has seemed to skew the entire interpretation of the letter of James toward doing good works. Since James writes that faith by itself is without works dead, and since many purebred Lutherans have such an aversion to talking about good works, James is seen here as being oriented toward works and not grace. That's why James has been called by scholars to be the least theological New Testament book. Again, that's why the letter of James was delayed being a part of the Bible until the final years that the Bible was put together, around 357 AD. Even Martin Luther questioned the wisdom of including the book of James in the New Testament. He called it the Epistle of Straw. But as I think the value in the letter of James is that he talks about real faith for real life. Yeah, maybe James is the least theological book in the New Testament. James is the most practical book. Maybe least theological, but the most practical for how to live out your faith. It's true that we like real things, real coffee, real leather, real Coke as the real thing. James gives us real insights into real faith for real life. Now, James is not opposed to grace. He's not opposed to grace at all. The Apostle Paul was not opposed to good works. He just wants to get the order right. Paul writes, for by grace you have been saved through faith. You were created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand to be your way of life. The order of those is important. We're saved by grace through faith for good works. The order is important. The prepositions are important. We're not saved by grace, by works. We're saved by grace. By grace through faith for good works. When you contrast Paul and James, we've gone through a lot with Paul. Now let's contrast and compare them. The problem Paul was dealing with was legalism. Paul was talking to a group of people, Judaizers, remember, who said that you have to keep all the Jewish rules and regulations to be a Christian. You have to be circumcised, eat some food and not others, and then you could consider yourself Jewish, and then you could become a Christian. James, the problem he was dealing with was not legalism, he was dealing with laxity, okay? Not legalism, but laxity. James was dealing with a group of Jewish Christians who had been in Jerusalem, but then after the great persecution in Acts chapter 8, after the stoning of Stephen, they moved out of the city where they had support from other Christians at the Jerusalem church, and they went back to the surrounding towns and regions. James was writing around 48 to 50 AD, right around the time when Saul, was persecuting Christians, and James is the first letter in the New Testament written to Jewish Christians who had dispersed around the Mediterranean Sea. These Christians, Jewish Christians, early Christians, no longer had contact with teachers and preachers who nurtured them. They didn't have their original church for fellowship and support. They didn't have the original apostles and disciples who encouraged them. They went back to their homes and friends and neighbors, and they were tempted to backslide into their old way of thinking that said, doesn't matter what you do as long as you believe. James was not dealing with Paul's issue of legalism. He was dealing with the problem of laxity. So Paul wants to say, yes, it matters a great deal on what you do and how you live. So when Paul talks about works, he's talking about the works of the Jewish laws and regulations. When James talks about works, he's simply talking about a Christian lifestyle. As such, James would say, yes, of course. James would say, yes, of course, we're saved by grace through faith for good works, living a real faith in a real life. Second, when you compare and contrast Paul and James, Paul's focus is more on the root of salvation and how faith has to do with more internal, unseen stuff. James, instead of talking about the root of salvation in Jesus Christ, is more interested in the fruit of salvation in our lives, which is more external and more seen. The root Paul focuses on, more internal, unseen. James, the fruit of salvation, more external and seen. James is talking more about the acts of love, which should characterize the lifestyle of a Christian. It's like having a tree is going to have both roots and it's going to have fruit. You don't get fruit from a tree with dead roots. Paul focuses on the root of salvation. James focuses on the fruit of salvation and his emphasis on real faith for real life. Now, third differentiation is Paul's purpose is to focus on how to know I'm a Christian. James' focus is not how to know I'm a Christian, it's how to show I'm a Christian, right? Paul wants to focus on how to become a believer because Paul was writing to convert non-believers and Gentiles into coming believers. Paul wants to tell them about how they come to know Jesus. James was writing to people who were already believers, who knew Jesus already, and wanted to focus on how those dispersed Christians, how they should not become lazy Christians and believe like and behave like an unbeliever. So Paul and James are not really contradictory, they're complementary. Because what we do, what you do, matters. Faith isn't just something you think about. Faith is something how we think, feel, act, and that determines our destiny. That's why James wants to say, talk is cheap. Put your life where your faith is. James wants to talk about regeneration and renewal and commitment, not only knowing, but showing. So, in chapter 3, James wants to say that faith is not just something you say. Real faith is not something you just say or talk about. In verse 14, he says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but no works? Can your faith save you? Notice that the question is phrased in such a way. If you say you have faith, if you claim to have faith, think of all the people who claim to be Christian, who claim to believe. Back in Jesus' time, Jesus even said, many of you will say to me, Lord, Lord, maybe you won't enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one, Jesus says this, but only the one who does the will of my Father. It's not just James, it's not just Paul, it's Jesus who wants us to do the will of God. It's more than just knowing the right things or saying the right things. It's more than just talk. It's making it real in your life. James goes on to say, faith is not something just you think about. It's also not just something you feel, like butterflies in your heart when you give $10 to someone who is sitting there with a God loves you kind of sign. Real faith is more than just emotions and sentimentality. It's not just feeling good or having a nice quiver in your liver during worship and then going home and never acting on it. James gives an illustration. He says, if a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and be filled, and yet do not supply for their bodily needs, what good is that? James is practical. Real faith is more than just sympathy. Real faith takes the initiative and gets your hands dirty with people's everyday needs. Real faith is generous in giving of your time and energy, money and commitments. It's not just seeing someone's need and being overwhelmed and doing nothing. It's meeting someone and making a difference in their life. James lays it on the line. If you want real faith, it's not just something you think about. It's not just something you feel in your heart, quiver in your liver. It's doing something about it. Third, he says, real faith is not just something you think. For some, faith is kind of an intellectual exercise that gives us something to really think about. One of my friends used to end his sermons with the words, think about these things. Okay, well, I mean, that's fine. Faith is something more than that. It's just not something you think. It's something you know and you show. Verse 18, James says, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I by my works will show you my faith. I by my works will show you my faith. Someone said that faith is like calories. You can't see them, but you can see the results, right? Faith is like calories. You can't see calories, but you can see the results. You can't see faith, but you can see it. It's not just knowing, it's also showing. Fourth, James says that faith is not just something you believe. 86% of Americans believe that there's a God. In fact, James writes, you believe God is one, you do well. Even demons believe but shudder. Even demons believe that there's a God. And why does the devil shudder? Because the devil understands the majesty and awesomeness of God. If you did a survey in your town and asked people, do you believe that there's a God? Most of them would say yes. But if you ask them, do you go to church? Do you read the Bible? Do you donate your time? Do you give money? Does knowing God make a difference in your life? And you'd probably get some pretty different answers. Real faith is not just something you say or think or feel or believe. It's something that you do. Faith is active. Faith is not passive. Faith is commitment. Faith is real. It's something you say, think, feel, believe, but ultimately something you do. So, next, Paul says in chapter 4:11, we'll skip over to chapter 4:11. He says, do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters. Whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks evil against a law and judges a law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and destroy. So then who are you to judge your neighbor? Now, James was writing about something that was happening right there in the Mediterranean world. They had been brought up, they were taught how to treat one another. They were going back into their towns and people were saying all kinds of petty things about one another, gossiping and all the like. They weren't part of the original. The people that they went back to were not part of the original Jerusalem church. And they were being petty, they were being judgmental, and that they were backbiting, they were criticizing one another. Paul says, when you go into your context, remember what you've been taught. Replace all of that pettiness, bickering, with a spirit of love and grace and forgiveness and restoration. Remember how we've talked about several times that mercy triumphs over judgment? Mercy triumphs over judgment in the life of a Christian. There's two parts to the law. Jesus says, what's the greatest law? Love God and love one another. Anything outside of those parameters is less than what is expected from those who follow Jesus. So that's what James wants to write about. To those believers who had dispersed, keep faithful. Don't remember what you've heard. Make sure it's your head, your heart, not just something you think, not just something you feel, not just something you do, but it's a totality of that. Faith is action. Faith is showing the love of God to those around you. That's what James wants to say. He says at the end of chapter 4, he says, you're a mist that appears for a while and then vanishes. It's like he's saying our lives are a fog that roll in the morning but then burns off by noon. In other places in the Bible, our lives are talked about like a leaf, like a grass, like a shadow, like a cloud, like a puff of smoke, because we're always one heartbeat away from eternity. It's sobering to think about. We're always one heartbeat away from eternity. Life can be short. Life can be unexpected. It can go fast between Hot Wheels and a wheelchair. Diapers, dignity, decay, death. You can presume that you can have your whole life in front of you, but what we're reminded of in the letter of James, you're like a mist that appears for a while and then vanishes. So take advantage of every moment. That's why the letter of James is so important. Don't put off doing good. Don't say, I'll start all this tomorrow. Pastor Eric, thanks for this lesson, but I'll start next week. No. James says your life is like a mist that appears for a while and then vanishes. Take the opportunity now. Don't put it off. If you know to do the right thing, don't think, I'll do that sometime. Do it now. Take your faith. Make it real in your life. And as we end the letter of James, think of this question. What is the gift that you have that the world around you desperately needs to receive? What is the gift that you have in your life, in your faith, that the world around you desperately needs to receive? What is your gift of love and joy and peace and grace that you need to share with those around you? There's only you who has your cohort of people around you. That cohort, that group, that world around you is unique to you. What is the gift that you have that those around you desperately need to receive? Don't wait. Share it. Give it. Let them know that you believe in an awesome God that has loved you from the time of your birth and will love you for the rest of your entire life. And the world around you needs not only to hear it, they need to see it. How can you show what you believe to those around you? Take a chance to do that. Take a opportunity that has been given you to show that to those around you. I look forward to being with you in the next episode, and until then, you take good care. Bye-bye.